This video is a recording of a panel from Storycrafting Sessions Science Fiction, a free virtual conference hosted by the Weeknight Writers Group in partnership with Renaissance Press. To learn more about the Weeknight Writers Group, go to businessforauthors.com/weeknight-writers, and to learn more about Renaissance Press, you can go to pressesrenaissancepress.ca.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Races, Religions, and Cultures, How to Ethically Borrow Inspiration from Existing Cultures panel. My name is Charlie. I am a queer, disabled Asian American author who writes mainly dark sci-fi fantasy, and I will be your moderator today. This event is sponsored by Renaissance Press, a Canadian publisher dedicated to publishing, supporting, and uplifting marginalized authors. Thanks to their generosity, we've been able to include live captions with this panel. Diana has posted a link to Renaissance in the chat if you would like to find them. And I am now going to introduce our panelists. First off, we have Kaki Olson. Would you like to say a little bit about yourself and maybe why you wanted to be on this panel today?
Sure, thanks for including me in this. So I'm Kaki Olson. I am very Scandinavian, if you can't tell by my skin tone, but on the other hand, I am a member of Citizen Potawatomi Nation. A few weeks ago, I went to a conference on how to write developing nations, and the anthropologist in charge said that it was a miracle that America was discovered because the people here had never had a belief system before, and it is that kind of ignorance that I want to work around and talk about. And I write science fiction and fantasy as well as horror. My latest publication is a collection of holiday sci-fi tales, and it's called Miracle on Deck 34. Thanks.
Thank you. Next up, we have Moss Whelan. Please go ahead and give us a little about yourself and maybe why you wanted to be on this panel today.
Hi, great to be here, Moss Whelan. I'm an author of Greyhawk of Terrapin, and I enjoy writing in fantasy and science fiction. And one of the sort of things I wanted to get into my work was an awareness of First Nations in Vancouver, BC, and to it's like how to create that awareness of language extinction, which is happening here. How to bring just the how-to and approaching local First Nations, asking these questions. It's like, do I just listen? Is there a way for me to participate without invading, in a sense?
Thank you. Next is Elisa Bonin. Please tell us a little bit about yourself and why you wanted to be here.
Sure. Hi, I'm Elisa. So I'm a debut author. I write YA fantasy. My debut coming out this year is, you cannot see it because my background is blurred. It's not because it's obscene. Just give me 1 second to remove the background blur. But so my debut novel is called Dauntless, and it's now my screen said, it's a sapphic Filipino fantasy.
Wow.
And I am originally from the Philippines, so I know you can't tell. I'm half Spanish, but I was born and raised in the Philippines, and I'm Filipino. And I wanted to write this book because I wanted to write fantasy set in a world that I had experience with. So why I wanted to be on this panel is because when I was writing Dauntless, I really had to think about what I could bring to this book, because even though I am Filipino, like I said, I'm half Spanish. And so that means that I approach even Filipino culture from a different perspective from somebody who doesn't have this close proximity to our former colonizers. And I thought it would be a good experience to talk about, to hear what you all have to say, and also to talk about how I approached doing this in Dauntless and how I'd want to approach doing this in other books. And a little bit more about me. I'm also autistic and I'm bi, so yeah.
Thank you. Our last panelist And I do not want to mess up your last name, so I'm going to let you say that. This is Priya. Please introduce yourself and tell us why you wanted to be on the panel.
Hello, my name is Priya Shrather. I'm a speculative fiction writer, a nerd on Medium, and copywriter. The reason why I wanted to be on this panel is having been on both sides of the equation, as someone who hired a sensitivity reader for one of my books, Neo-Mecha Mayhem, because it is set in Okinawa Island off the coast of Japan, and as someone who's been a sensitivity reader for regular books, audiobooks, and for a Tumblr Ask blog that specifically tackles this topic. As for why did I wanted to come to talk about this topic, actually, to be honest, I came for Diana, who ran the conference. I started following her on Twitter and seeing that she was a really nice person and very reassuring. And when she put out this call and I saw that there was one that was going to be talk about writing, fantasy, and about representation, I thought, well, I do have some experience in this field on both sides, for intention and for doing no harm. So I thought I would come, and I'm eager to hear everyone's perspectives.
Thank you. Yeah, Diana's pretty great. Thank you, Diana, for making this all possible. Okay, so I'm going to jump into questions now. The first half of this panel is going to be answering my questions. And then if anyone in the audience has questions, please pop them into the chat and we will get to those in the second half of the panel. So my first question for all of you is, how would you define the difference between cultural appropriation and cultural appreciation in terms of finding inspiration? Kaki, would you like to go first?
Of course, you asked me the hard question first, but I'm happy to give a stab, and I may contribute something more intelligent later. For me, the difference between cultural appropriation and cultural appreciation has to do with understanding that it is not your society or not your culture that is being represented. I remember having written a book in which the main character is Jewish, and I asked several Jewish friends about writing this character, and half of them said, we would love to see this explored. We really like this story. And the others said, you are not Jewish. I would like you not to write this thing. And so cultural appropriation is ignoring the voices that say this is not your right, or this is something that people would take issue with. And cultural appreciation is approaching it from the lens of trying to honor what the culture is and what lessons things can be taught when we're taking it into consideration for our own lives, when it's something that's other than our own experience.
Yeah, and I think that brings up an important part, is that no culture is going to be a monolith, right? You know, so you can't just ask one person, one Jewish person, hey, is this okay? And then, you know, go based off of that. You've got to get a larger sample size and figure out what else could be playing into that. Thank you.
I also
Elise?
wanted to follow up on that comment because it's a really good one. When we talk about harassment in professional settings, one of the things that they emphasize is that it is not the position of the person who can be the harasser to decide whether or not it's offensive to say or do something. It is the responsibility of the person who is receiving this to understand their relationship to it. So never assume that you are automatically going to be in the right.
Absolutely. Yes. You do not get to decide if someone was hurt by you or not. They do. Elisa, would you like to discuss this?
Yeah. So it's a hard question because there's a really fine line between appropriating something and appreciating something.
Mhm.
And where I found myself, like when I was still writing my own books before I became published, when I was just writing for myself, where I found myself realizing that maybe I was veering too far from one side of the line or the other, was if you ever find yourself, or if you ever hear somebody saying the words, right, like, I want to write this to give these people a voice, you really need to sit there and ask yourself, if you're doing this to appreciate somebody's culture, if you're appropriating it, like, why can't they write the story themselves? Like, why can't you find a writer who is from that culture who can write the story? But on the other hand, we're all science fiction and fantasy writers. And when you write science fiction and fantasy, especially sci-fi and fantasy that's set in these enormous sprawling worlds, you don't want to have just one culture in the entire whole world. So you have to find this way that you can show that this world is diverse without taking important parts of somebody else's culture and making basically like your own aesthetic of it. And I had a hard time even in Dauntless. I had to be very careful because, as I said, like I am Filipino and everybody in Dauntless is Filipino, but there are aspects of Filipino culture that I shouldn't be writing about. And I realized that if I started writing about these things, like indigenous Filipino culture, for example, like I would be crossing the line into appropriation. So that's not like a hard and fast academic answer because I'm actually not sure where the hard line is. But I think that your intent plays a big role. And I think whether or not you're willing to listen to other people telling you from that culture or from those groups telling you, hey, I think this is like appropriation. Hey, I'm not comfortable with you writing this. If you're willing to listen to them and back off, that also plays a role, I think, in whether something is appropriation or appreciation. Yeah. So long rambling answer. I actually don't know where to find the hard line, but I think it's a case by case basis, and you should be open to hearing other people talk about it. Yeah.
Definitely, there's a lot of nuance in this discussion for sure. Priya, would you like to give your thoughts?
I think Elisa hit the nail on the head. It's all about if you're willing to listen, and also when you're willing to admit you're wrong, because it's not just about if you want to give people a voice. It's also, okay, suppose you do want to create a new fantasy world culture, and you decide to base it off a real world culture. The first question, of course, is why do you want to talk about the awards at all? Do you want to maybe explore how it would work differently in a fantasy setting? And are you willing to hear from people who are in that culture? And I think I've been struggling with that because there aren't a lot of Indians in speculative fiction writing that I have seen relative to white people. And if you want to send me all the lovely Indian fantasy writers that you know, or if you want to plug yourself, feel free. I've met another Priya who has been awesome. But I've been thinking about this a lot in regards to Tamora Pierce, YA fantasy author, and whom up till about a few years ago I thought was a cool person. Tamora wrote this novel called Shatterglass, and it was very influential on me, so much that one of my works in progress is named after it, though it's about Gravity Falls, really, more so than otherworldly fantasy. And I thought it talks about Indian culture and the caste system. Obviously, like, it seems to be that white authors talk more about how maybe this is kind of messed up, that you have one caste considered unclean and handling the menial work, and people are stuck. Whereas if you look at, say, Indian comics, they mention it, but it's sort of accepted in the mythologies of the worlds and such, because they're talking about mythologies about different time periods. And I thought this was all fine, but then I don't know if anyone remembers the whole Black Witch nonsense from a few years ago. So the Black Witch is this novel that was supposed to be a fantasy novel in another world tackling racism. It is not. And I read a review that someone did going page by page and pointing out, actually, no, this is pretty messed up. And the reviewer said this wasn't for her benefit. She didn't earn any money off of it, but because she found it so terrible, and she thought it went against the point because the author was white and using fantasy creatures to talk about racism, like Selkies in cages and such, and racism should be wrong. Like, you know. And then Tamora Pierce jumped in and said, maybe we should read the book first before judging, but there are two things against this. Reviewers are here. Best-selling authors, here. Indies like us, somewhere in the middle. But there is an imbalance, and so the reviewer got a lot of hate for the fact that she was willing to do the work. And here's the thing, Tamora admitted she didn't read the book, but you know what? She blurbed it. So she claims she read the book. And she did not read the book. And I do admit I was very disappointed. Like, I thought you were cool. You signed my magazine when I was a teenager, and I missed your signing. And so since then, I haven't been able to enjoy her books because I'm thinking, yes, I just saw the oh no. Yes, exactly. That was it, the oh no. And since then, I haven't been able to enjoy her books because I'm questioning, have you always been like this? Or is it just something that's developed? And especially since it led to one of my very first friends who was into fantasy fiction bonding over those books. And I think about it a lot that there is no clear-cut answer. I feel like cultural appropriation is when you're not willing to listen. It's also if you're not willing to admit you're wrong. And also, for the record, the book is terrible. I did read it, and I drank a lot of wine after. And also, I can tell the author has never played violin because the main character is a violinist. I played for several years since I was 6. And I could
Oh
just,
gosh.
you can just tell sometimes that someone does not play an instrument, but obviously instrument appropriation isn't the topic here.
Yeah, but thank you, Priya.
But yeah.
All right, Moss, any last thoughts on this question?
I just wanted to riff off of what Priya just said and plunk in the term own voices. And that was important for me in positioning myself, like say my point of view character, my protagonist. I want to get away from the cultural appropriation that is all around us, and it it's not like it's, oh well, we're past that now. It's like, no, this is continuing. Let's create this awareness. How can we with appreciation, how can we create a celebration? How can we create, sort of get closer to this awareness? And I'm sure it's been around for a while, but it feels like maybe it was during the pandemic or somewhere before that, and just sort of this growing awareness of, oh, I ought to be writing from my experience, my background, my family's experience, and yes, getting closer to these other perspectives. But if I'm not respecting others' perspectives, then I'm creating this kind of limitation. I just remember talking with one author who really wanted to celebrate. I think it was in Africa, and so this is I think it was in South Africa, and so this is a white South African writing about a Black South African, and this argument that's coming up of perspective, like say, how can you know? How can you fully grasp? And it was a good conversation, but ultimately it sort of created this distance between us because they were going to go ahead and have a point of view character that wasn't from their own voice.
Yeah, the own voice debate has been pretty ongoing, but let's refocus back onto trying to find that inspiration from other cultures that are not your own. And in that vein, this next question is very similar actually to something that Elisa brought up earlier. What would you suggest to someone who is hoping to bring awareness to a culture that is not their own, to ensure that they do not end up appropriating that culture? And Elisa, would you like to go first?
Yeah. So I think there's a bunch of steps that you need to do before you publish a book that takes inspiration from other cultures. And the first is before you even start writing, right? Like sit down with yourself and ask yourself, why are you writing the story? Like, are you writing the story because you're trying to tell an important story to another culture that maybe they could tell better? Or are you just, are you trying to add some diversity to your fantasy world, or are you trying to tell somebody else's story, right? If you've determined that, you should be writing the story, the second thing that you need to do is research very heavily which culture that you're drawing inspiration for, because you don't want to just rely on stereotypes. Like, I'm using the example of let's say that you want to have a character in your fantasy world, a side character who comes from a different culture or race that's inspired from something that's like real world. You should be very careful to not introduce them using basically like the barest, worst stereotypes that you can think about of that culture. And I don't really want to name any names or do any specifics, but I think we can all think of some things on top of our heads. Like if you think about which types of people in old fantasy tend to be like villains or come from villainous areas of the world, I think you have a pretty clear picture of like bad stereotypes. The third, so research deeply, make sure that you aren't using something that's incredibly significant, that maybe you don't understand all the nuances of that, like really strong aspect or really sacred aspects of people's religion or culture or something. And then the third thing you should do is find people who are of that culture and have them read your work before you show it to the general public and actually listen to what they have to say, right? Because no matter how much you sit there with yourself, no matter how good your intentions are, no matter how good you are at researching, like no matter how many books you read, you're always going to miss something that somebody who's actually lived that culture might pick up. And it's hard to take criticism, I know. It's hard as a writer to take criticism, to show your work to someone else and hear them say that, hey, this is not that good. But if you're not willing to take criticism from people of a certain culture, you shouldn't be writing about them.
Exactly.
Yeah. So.
Thank you. Priya, would you like to answer this question?
Well, I would probably say cough Arthur C. Clarke cough, because I apparently found out he wrote about Sri Lankans and is considered like a Sri Lankan fantasy expert. But I was thinking about this, and if I've had $1 for every time I've told the same person, please get a sensitivity reader, I'd have $3. It isn't a lot, to quote Phineas and Ferb, but it's weird that I've had to say this 3 times. And of course, that would be my first thing, is get a sensitivity reader. And obviously there's maybe gatekeeping involved. You might be a writer struggling with a day job who may not have, say, $100 to drop on someone to read your short story, or $20 or $50, as it were. So I'm not saying you have to pay a sensitivity reader all the time. It would just be nice, out of respect to them, and so that they aren't doing free emotional labor in case your story is wrong. The but here is that's not your only option. Thanks to the internet, your possibilities are open for how to get help. Like if you're on NaNoWriMo, and Camp NaNoWriMo is next month, so writers start your projects. There are forums where you can specifically ask for help with this. You can ask for expertise from fellow users. And some people can be surprising. Like if they can answer questions about you could go scuba diving in a place with a giant kraken that hypnotizes mermaids and survive, I'm sure someone could be able to answer, okay, does this story work and it won't cause hurt feelings or ruffled feathers? So don't be afraid to use your resources. Obviously, if you can't afford to pay a sensitivity reader, do, because doing that work can be exhausting for the person.
Absolutely.
Especially if they have to tell you and repeatedly, no, that's the wrong kind of Buddha. People don't use the laughing Buddha here. They use the Siddhartha Buddha. And something I learned that they're 2 different ones depending on culture.
Yeah.
And sometimes you may have to answer that if you're part of a minority, you have to explain, well, you have to have that well. But basically, you have to get a second opinion. And it just matters on your budget and your resources and your ability to be brave and put yourself out there on what you're willing to do. Though on that note, don't put your writing on a forum because that'll count as publication. Instead, keep it on a Google Doc, and if a person wants to, share it with them exclusively and make sure your link's set so it does not count as published and you don't have to resell it as a reprint.
For sure. All right. Moss, would you like to speak on this?
Sure. From the question, I was thinking, I had a couple different thoughts going on. Creating awareness, being upfront like say putting some kind of message of awareness, maybe at the back or in a section of the book, maybe even a footnote of explanation, rather than say taking and not making reference, but having something. Even beyond that, in social media, say discussing, talking about it while you're working on it, leaving it open so that others can be engaged and there can be this conversation. Again, rather than just sort of dropping something in, I'm going to use this and I'm not going to, participate. I'm not going to celebrate.
Yeah, that's a good point. I like that idea of like putting a foreword or something to state that this is why you're doing this, you're bringing awareness, and then actually bringing awareness to whatever that culture is. That's nice. Kaki.
So one of the things that I have done recently was I had what I call a Mount Sinai moment for one of my characters, and this is obviously a specific reference to Judeo-Christian theology more than culture. But my point with that is that you do not necessarily have to outright use what it is in that culture for it to be an inspiration. I have a person who used me as a sensitivity reader because she was writing a book that included several Cherokee readers or characters. And she said, I would just like you to look and see if this is a respectful way to address the interaction of white people in this period of time with Native populations. And I gave her as much information as I could based on my own experiences. Obviously, someone who's a modern member of a federally recognized tribe. But on the other hand, you can find ways to integrate parts of the culture. I have a lot of people who talk about, oh, I found my tribe and I have my spirit animal is a Princess Leia. And there are much better ways to articulate that. So in my opinion, if you're going to be using things that are not necessarily endemic to one specific culture or one specific experience, there are ways to examine the ways in which this particular practice or this particular aspect of the culture speaks to a need in the community for a specific type of interaction or a specific type of moral compass. And it is from that that you can draw things. If you're going to use things that are very specific to a certain culture, I agree that we should have some kind of note or forward or for further reading section in the book.
Okay, thank you. Next question. I'm going to say that it's broadly accepted. I think that the entire race species is evil trope is bad, right? You don't want to vilify an entire race or species. So with that in mind, what are ways you can avoid sweeping racial generalizations while also having people of that race be the antagonists in your story? Priya, would you like to go?
So I've been thinking about this. I think the first thing is to make not all races evil as consider motivation. Because why do people act this way? Sometimes there might be a very good reason, and there might be a case where someone who might be saying like the stereotype for terrorists are freedom fighters. It's that sometimes a person may engage in terrible stuff because they believe in something to address a legitimate grievance. And I think one movie that actually did a great job with this was The Black Panther. And rest in peace to Chadwick Boseman. Because even though obviously Killmonger is a bit violent and unreasonable and all of that, you can also see that it comes from a place of pain and from what his father wanted to do, which was seeing injustice and finding a way to correct it. And I think it's like, and obviously Killmonger's methods would have caused collateral damage, and he acknowledges it, and he would not have cared.
Mm-hmm.
But you're able to sympathize with him, and so is T'Challa, and realizing you may have had the wrong way of going about this, but I'm going to find a way to make things right, which he does by opening up a community center in Oakland and putting his genius little sister in charge of each of them. And so motivation is key. And also to avoid always chaotic evil, it could also be thinking, and this is obviously a lot to unpack in a panel, but thinking, okay, if you're doing another species, what are the origins of this? Like they recently found out goblins are anti-Semitic. They went, damn it, goblins are so cool. They can withstand great temperatures under mountains and pressures. They can organize stuff better than people can. But then I've talked with some Jewish friends who pointed out pointy ears, obsessed with money, devious and cunning, and I'm like, God damn it. So you also have to think, okay, what are your origins? And how are you, and what creatures are you going to use that may not cause harm? Maybe one day there will be a way to reclaim goblins and make them not a stereotype. But
I
it's
hope so.
flux.
Yeah. All right. Moss, would you like to answer this?
And could I have the question again?
Yes. What are ways you can avoid sweeping racial generalizations while also having people of that race be the antagonists in your story?
Right. And my thought was gray characters first, that's having characters that are not easy to peg down and on both sides of the equation. So having characters that are not immediately pigeonholed and stereotyped, and who say would go against the grain if being presented with this generalization. It's like, oh, they're all like that, and yet having this example of somebody who is not so easy to place. And then on the flip side, having the exact opposite. So characters from the perspective of the protagonist, who in contrast, it's like, oh, well, but that's me, that's us. And that's such a beautiful thing. I'm just imagining the conflict right there. I'm creating this setup, development, payoff of the relationship between these characters and this arc of realization. So lots of potential there.
Khaki.
One thing that I like to do when looking at it, the tendency for people to write monolithic racial characters is to find something that is either an inspiration or a core value that everyone can agree on, basically something that is either part of it, that religion, part of that nationality. For example, and to be slightly political, everyone in the United States works under the same constitution, but there are vastly different ways of approaching it depending on what your priorities are. And so if you have some kind of founding or establishing principle that they are both working from, you look at the ways that each of them can interpret it, or what it does to motivate their particular actions, or what they see as a lack or an injustice based on that guiding principle.
Yeah, I think providing a motivation that your readers can understand for that person is definitely a way to keep away from the racial generalizations. Elisa.
Yeah, I think everybody has already made some great points. I think just to add on to that, if there's room in your book, maybe they shouldn't be the only person of that race that you ever mention in your book. Because yes, everybody has the potential to be a villain. So it's not necessarily bad to have your villain be somebody from a different race or culture, but you should show that they are doing this not because of their race, or you're not saying that they're doing this because of their race or something about their culture, but rather because of who they are as a character and how they're interpreting what's happening around them. So I think if a good way to do that is just to not have them be like the only example of their race or culture in the book.
For sure.
Yeah.
All right, we're going to move on to some audience questions. Someone asked, when it comes to creating your own cultures, how do you feel people should approach creating cultures? If a culture is Asian coded, for example, how far should someone go to take inspiration from Asian cultures or focus on one and build up from there? Would anyone like to volunteer to go first to answer that?
I'll go.
Okay.
Much like, say, being inspired by a favorite book, rather than taking that, or whatever it is, a TV show, say, rather than taking it and making a copy, instead, going to many different wells of inspiration, and so sampling, borrowing, so that it isn't just one copy, and because that's going to right away be noticeable and obvious. Yeah, so that's a thought.
I think another thing we need to think of, especially when people are creating something to try and celebrate another culture, is that there's a balance between picking from a lot of different cultures, right, and making a new conglomeration, or focusing on one. And I think an example of that could be Moana. So when Moana came out, a lot of people just assumed it was a blanket Polynesian culture, right? And in a way, they did pick from a lot of different cultures. So it's not based on just one, but that was part of the criticism, right? Is that it didn't fully celebrate a certain culture. It took from a lot of them and kind of said, here you go. So there's definitely pros and cons to going both ways with that. Did anyone else want to answer that? Go ahead, Kaki.
So one of the things that I do when building a society, specifically in the context of the book, is to decide what you are trying to communicate about the society in the plot of your story and how it can further it. If you are trying to specifically talk about a certain social issue or a certain way that things have been done for a long time and need to be changed or cannot be changed, you can then look at what the society does to address that, what the society has historically not done to fulfill this. And so this is where you can draw from a lot of different inspirations, but you can also, while honoring and using the cultures, look at ways that context in history has been able to work with things rather than what we see as a fault or a lack.
Mm-hmm. Elisa or Priya, did either of you want to add to that? Go ahead.
I mean, first is don't do what Raya and the Last Dragon did, which is,
Yes.
and there's actually someone with whom I became great friends with after I posted my thoughts on the movie last year, linked me to a 3-part video where dozens of Southeast Asians weighed in to talk about all the things that the movie got wrong. And also, I mean, I'm not going to go into all of it, but I think what the mistake that Raya did was trying to tell a story and rubber stamp it and force it into something that it wasn't, and especially borrowing from different cultures without considering implications and such. And you can even see it in stuff like the second video talks about how he couldn't even get the wardrobe or the food right, or the fighting styles, all the basic elements. And it goes back to what we've been talking about is why? Well, why are you doing this? And what is your purpose for adding these? And it feels like, and with Turning Red coming out, I feel Turning Red is not otherworldly, but I think it managed to hit the nail on the head on what you want to do. If you're going to incorporate Asian mythology and put your own spin on it, which is the elements in the movie are very carefully chosen from a specific region, and the ones that aren't are there, like red pandas apparently aren't native to the regions where Cantonese is spoken, something I found out. But the creator said she knew this, but she said red pandas are cute, so she thought I would, and so she made artistic license for that. So I think you have to think about the why and what. What are you putting in and why?
For sure.
And don't borrow wholesale. Don't do a cookie cutter. If you're going to borrow from different cultures, make your own at that point, and maybe change it enough so that it's not recognizable to the Asian culture in question, so that you won't have a bunch of people pretty much coming close to an internet war because people are defending a movie or arguing against it
Yeah.
with some legitimate points and sometimes just utter frustration.
Thank you. Elisa?
Yeah, seconding what Priya said on Raya, which I was going to mention. I think that in like for me at least, like in my personal opinion, which is not the opinion of everybody, the issue I had with Raya was like, if you were going to take disparate elements from every Southeast Asian culture together to the point where like the result is basically unrecognizable as any one culture, you shouldn't market it as Southeast Asian, right? Like, we write speculative fiction, which means we have this lovely license to just make something up. Like we can make our own cultures from nothing. We can take, we can use different elements to make something that's completely unique and imaginary, but we shouldn't say that it's something that it's not, because that's just inviting people to ask fun questions like, why did you do this, and why did you insist that this was Southeast Asian representation? Like, who is this movie for? I think, like personally, I've only, like, when I borrow elements from a culture, it's usually from mine, and because I have two cultures, I have two different things to draw from, which is nice. But when I'm not, I try my best to make things up because I'm very scared of getting something wrong and hurting somebody. But that's just my 2 cents, right? Like on Raya and on, like, can you just take from a bunch of different pots and make something different?
Yeah. Yeah, that's a good point. And again, comes back to the Moana thing. If they hadn't marketed it as a Polynesian story, you know, that might not have had the backlash that it did. We have another question in the audience from Christina. 2 questions. 1, how do you go about finding sensitivity readers? And 2, is there a specific time within the publishing process that you should find one? Alpha, beta, querying, editing, professional editor, etc. Who would like to go first? Kaki.
In terms of finding a sensitivity reader, what time you should be doing it, I advise to, if you can at all possible, write down your idea, but then as soon as you get through the initial word dump, the part where you have got to tell this story and you have to do it in a certain way to get the plot to the end, at that point, I would recommend bringing in someone who can give you some initial thoughts. There are circumstances under which sensitivity readers will be actually required. My editors for an anthology called Unspun that I did, they asked me to specifically seek out 2 or 3 people who could read it from the perspective of the other culture that I was using and tell me whether or not it was accurate and whether or not it was appreciative of the culture that I was trying to represent. But before I had that reading from the 3 people, towards the beginning, I worked with a specific person just to develop the ideas and make sure that I was understanding the context of this culture and what they considered it to represent.
Someone else? Priya?
I mean, fortunately, in an ideal world, and obviously, if publishers by themselves would have the sensitivity readers on their editorial department, because that way the burden doesn't fall on the author. But given the mass resignations in publishing that happened a week ago, that probably will not be happening for quite some time. But fortunately, there are many ways to find sensitivity readers. If you do a Google search, there are databases that will link you to places. I've signed up for some databases. The other is look for websites. For example, Writing with Color is a Tumblr blog that specifically talks about these issues. And so, full disclosure, I do contribute there, though I've kind of been on the wayside to gush over people's cats, the mods' cats. So I'm probably not the best expert. The but here is there's always going to be someone, but always take stuff with a grain of salt, because, say, a teen reader who's agreeing to write on stuff might not have the same nuance that you have in the sense. or they might have a perspective that you might disagree on other principles. Like with Neo Mecha, I did send a review copy to someone who I thought would be cool and and after I had done the work of the sensitivity reader, but they marked it as a DNF because they said there's a lot of fat shaming in the novel that may be uncomfortable. And that was news to me because I based the main character off my own weight issues. And so I admit that kind of hurt. And obviously I didn't say anything, but I kind of just reached out to them and asked, okay. Like I talked to them. I didn't tell them to take the review down. I just asked for their perspective and more on it. And so always have a grain of salt because sensitivity readers are people too. But use Google. As mentioned, the NaNoWriMo forums are another great place to find resources. I might try the For the Words forums if you're on the website For the Words, where you can fight monsters using your word counts. So you do have to pay for it after a trial, full disclosure on that. And as for when, it really depends because we're at different stages in our projects. In some cases, you may sometimes want to ask, is this concept racist? If it's still in the concept stage, because I like to think some books probably would have had a bit of reflection if that had been asked. Other times you do want it before querying because you're like, if I want to represent myself as own voices, or as that, I want show an age and I've done my homework. So I think you have to evaluate the work first before you can make that decision. So definitely one thing, if someone in your private critique group tells you maybe you should get one, you should probably listen to them rather than get defensive on feedback and
Definitely.
say freedom of speech and all that. Yes, this has actually happened to me. I'm not making this up. And they're like, maybe you should get a sensitivity reader. And I linked them to a database. And they went ranting for 20 minutes about how this was censorship. And so don't get defensive if someone in your critique group suggested, because if someone is doing that when your work is only among a few people, then maybe consider it. And if you can't afford a sensitivity reader, there are free resources that will help you. If you're going to rely on a trusted friend, make sure to check with the friend and set boundaries with them so that you're not giving them too much work to do so that they serve as your token. Because that can happen regardless of who you are. You might end up on one side of it, or so forth. Or you might be the one who might ask too much. So if you're going to ask a friend, set boundaries and ask. That way, your friendship won't be ruined by that. Because I've had a friendship ruined by Game of Thrones for a whole different reason. And so you don't want to take someone you care about for granted. I know, I can tell. That's the long-suffering side of empathy.
Yes, boundaries are important regardless of whether you're doing paid services or not. Always set healthy boundaries. Moss or Kaki, did either of you want to extrapolate on that? Go ahead.
I'll go ahead. One example for me with sensitivity, getting feedback is locally. I'd mentioned we have language extinction in Vancouver. It's happening right now. There's one fluent speaker left, and there's a push for getting the language used and out there. And so I thought, oh, I'll incorporate it. And two, I'll sort of say, be right out there in the fictional work and saying, this is what's going on. So one side is, I'm listening to one side, but all of a sudden there was this other side. So say sensitivity on two fronts. And the other side is, the language is, the ownership, it is the First Nations people in Vancouver. It's the Salish people here, right? It's their language. No one else should speak it. And so there's this conflict of sensitivity. This is something I didn't know previously, and sort of walked into this ongoing debate. And I'm learning more and more, but it's just amazing. The other example is I'm reading a collection of science fiction from South Korea, and I got to be there for 2 years, and I knew nothing about Korea before that. And I ended up there, and found there's many factions, and so it becomes difficult. It's good awareness, but at the same time there's so much upset, say Korean War with conflict with Japan that hasn't gone away, but it's not one-sided. There's many sides to the puzzle.
Mm-hmm. Jackie, did you want to add anything?
Not at this time.
Okay. We've got time for, I think, probably one more question. How do you feel about books that have no distinctive races, but still have different cultures, like Our World, but instead more of a general mixed race ethnicity, especially one where race doesn't become a plot point? Oh, I lost it. Especially where race doesn't become a plot point, but I'm assuming the author still wants to be clear that not every character is white. Does anyone want to speak on that?
Well, since I did not have a good answer for the last question, I'll take a stab at this one again. So I do like this idea. I think it's important to, while there are no clear-cut races, it is homogenizing and possibly problematic to have no distinctions. And so there are other ways to do it. Something that I have seen done effectively is to kind of embrace what I think of as the melting pot. And yes, that is a very American term, but something where there are a confluence of influences and cultural norms and standards, but something where they are able to be accepted and integrated by multiple different levels of society or other I'm having a hard time finding the word for it, but it's something where it does not have to have a distinction, but there has to be presence of it in order for it to be effective.
Okay. Elisa?
Yeah. So, I'm a person of mixed race. We definitely exist, and we're out here. I think if you're writing like sci-fi that's set in like the far future, I guess like where I'm trying to figure this answer out, it's like, is this world Earth? Because if this is Earth in the far future, you may have to do a lot of like groundwork to sort of figure out how this happened and what this means, right? And okay, everybody, if this is like, what I'm trying to get at is I just don't want to be in a situation where like you say that we don't think about race anymore, but you only have one culture, and that culture is possibly like the majority culture today, right? Like if it's hard, it depends. Without reading the book, I wouldn't be able to say, because like, I mean, do I like the idea? Yeah, I mean, I think it's cool that I think it's cool to imagine a world where people aren't discriminated as because of their race. But I have a hard time like answering a question on hypotheticals, right? Because we write sci-fi and fantasy, and everything is possible.
For sure.
So I think you just have to make sure which real world parallels you're intentionally or accidentally drawing, and what you might be saying in that world, right?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Mas or Priya, did either of you want to talk about it?
I'll go.
Okay.
And sorry, could I have the question again?
Yes. How do you feel about books that have no distinctive races, and is instead more of a general mixed race ethnicity, especially where race doesn't become a plot point, but the author still wants to be clear that not every character is white?
I remember having a conversation a while ago about this, and I felt it was almost like, say, a hope of getting rid of issues, conflicts, history especially of colonization, of slavery, and just sort of say to sort of like, oh, that's all over, that it's, that's in the past, that there's this hope for a narrative that's sort of like this solution, and it's too easy. It's this sort of a negation of what exists. And on one hand, I'm going, oh, of course, this is a relief. Yeah, I can't say for everybody, but it's this sort of utopia that's not, and it dodges the bullet of however you want to call it, a justice of the name of it escapes me in as far as in Canada with anyways, to actually be coming to the table, dealing with these issues, and this sort of just erases it. And I'll leave it up to Priya to carry on.
I was thinking about this because you do see this more in science fiction dystopias, at least in my experience. And if anyone wants to comment and say, oh, this is actually in fantasy, then feel free. But I was thinking about how, like, The Giver was the first, like, mainstream dystopia for middle grade and YA. I read that first in 5th grade because I was in a gifted program, and our teacher felt we could help some of the more disturbing scenes in it. Great guy, by the way, Mr. Gonzalez, and thank you for being patient with me. But I was thinking about the fact that this is something that The Giver addresses, and not in the way that describes race. He talks about color. He said color, and he talks specifically about the color red. Is a color like red gives you choices, and choices are dangerous because you might make the wrong choice. And it doesn't matter, say, if it's about your toy or the sled you have in a memory, but it may matter for your job. It may matter for what you choose to wear or how you look. And the reason for sameness was to avoid the conflict that comes from choices. And it's not really said obliquely, but Jonas is given a memory. Like, for context, for those who don't know The Giver, it's a dystopia where one person has to remember the past. And so the main character, Jonas, is given memories of our world and implied of how it ended. And one is about poachers killing an elephant. And Jonas, it's the first time Jonas has seen black people. And he's just very astonished by he's astonished by it because everyone is sameness. And the implications are there that in this world, sameness meant removing the color, not just from hair, but from melatonin. And it's not a good thing because this, along with a lot of other factors, I'm not going to spoil the big twist, even though this is 20 years old.
And we do have to start wrapping up anyways.
Yeah, we don't have
But
time to
before we run out of time, thank you so much to Diana and the Weeknight Writers Group for hosting today's conference.
This video is a recording of a panel from Storycrafting Sessions, Science Fiction, a free virtual conference hosted by the Weeknight Writers Group in partnership with Renaissance Press. To learn more about the Weeknight Writers Group, go to businessforauthors.com/weeknight-writers. And to learn more about Renaissance Press, you can go to pressesrenaissancepress.ca.